Dear friends, welcome to Carmel Radiant Sunday Gospel Reflections. We are celebrating 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Today, Jesus' radical invitation to his disciples sounds harsh, difficult, and full of unsettling matters. In Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33, his call to discipleship is very stark. Whoever comes to me, he says, and does not hate father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. This saying fits thematically with Luke chapter 12, verses 51 to 53, on which we recently meditated, where Jesus warns of families being divided over his message, because Jesus, in his person and message, requires those who would follow him to answer the ultimate allegiance question. It is not surprising that he may inherently bring family strife. The language of this particular saying, however, raises concern for many for sure. Does Jesus really call us to hate our biological families and our very lives? Two observations are helpful in this regard. First, Jesus is using hyperbolic language as he does frequently in his teaching, especially Matthew chapter 18, verses 8 to 9. This becomes clear when we compare this saying in Luke with its parallel in Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Matthew, drawing on the same Jesus tradition as Luke, seems to have interpreted the more stark language of hate to refer to primary allegiance. For Matthew, this saying indicates that our primary allegiance must be to Jesus rather than to family, which ultimately resonates with Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5, where God says to Moses to love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. A second helpful observation, the use of hate in Luke might reflect an idiom that comes from Hebrew in Genesis chapter 29, verses 30 to 31. We hear that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, and that Leah was hated by Jacob. A similar use of the Hebrew word for hate occurs in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 to 17, where it is also clear that the issue is one of preference or allegiance. This gels with what we have seen in Luke and Matthew. Jesus is not calling his followers to hate their families in terms of emotional response. Instead, he calls for undivided loyalty to himself above all loyalties. The next saying emphasizes the same point about loyalty. Discipleship is defined by following Jesus and carrying the cross. This phrase indicates that giving up self-interest and competing loyalties are central to discipleship. Neither of these sayings of Jesus lend themselves to an easy way of life or a low-cost form of faith. Instead, they stress the high cost of following Jesus. This high cost ultimately centers on totality of faithfulness and love and commitment. The two brief parables that follow illustrate this cost by suggesting two scenarios. The first envisions a landowner building a tower, either for storing produce or guarding land and animals. If the landowner has not estimated how much the tower will cost, it is possible that the project will remain unfinished due to lack of funds. The end result will be ridicule from all who see the unfinished structure. The second story is about a king who assesses the number of his troops in light of the greater number that his enemy possesses. If he cannot win with the number of soldiers he had, the only wise course will be to negotiate with his enemy long before they meet in battle. Jesus uses these two stories to illustrate the necessity of counting the cost of discipleship. Jesus extols a commitment to finishing the discipleship journey once begun or not beginning at all. Following Jesus is an all or nothing proposition. The concluding summary makes the connections clear. None of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. For this theme we find also in Luke chapter 12. In this passage, Jesus calls people to a kind of discipleship that is not cheap grace, not easy, and not to be entered into without deep consideration of the consequences and costs. This passage speaks to the importance of loyalty and allegiance to Jesus over all other competing loyalties, including family, self-interest, and possessions. While emphasis is laid in the earlier part of Luke 14 on the redemption and freedom that Jesus brings and the inclusive nature of God's kingdom are assumed in this last part of the chapter, those inclusive and redemptive themes should not dull our sense that here in chapter 14 verses 28 to 33 are some difficult sayings of Jesus for our consideration. We will always prefer preaching and teaching about God's grace, that is, God's own covenant loyalty to redeem and save, but we ought not to neglect preaching about covenant loyalty that is expected from us in return. Salvation in Jesus is not merely a transaction, it is at heart a covenantal relationship, and no relationship lasts without loyal commitments and actions. Because the one who redeems us also calls us into costly discipleship. Jesus' command to follow me is both gift as well as a demand. In the later narrative of Acts, Luke will depict the early church carrying out a vision of Jesus' teaching with respect to possessions that places them in community with one another. The Acts account appears as a less radical but perhaps more realistic vision of the commitment. As the believers had all things in common, they would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Acts of the Apostles chapter 2, and we also find a reference in chapter 4. The language of Luke in chapter 14 verse 33 is fulfilled but in a slightly modified manner in the Acts of the Apostles. Jesus' radical call is tough to preach in our society as a setting in which family values take central stage in our political as well as rhetorical discourse. And what follower of Jesus doesn't love one's family? But Paul apparently understood the basic nature of Jesus' expectation, since he too chose not to marry. For both Jesus and Paul, their eschatological visions affected their ethical and behavioral choices. Today, many longer subscribe to the intense expectations of the end of the world, even if some hold on to a sense of the end in their theological systems. Today's contemporary church has to wrestle with the reality of following a radical countercultural prophet. His message and actions will not always be easy to follow or to transfer simplistically into our 21st century context. However, we are called to live our lives in total commitment to Jesus. Does not mean we need to neglect our responsibility towards our family, our parents, and our brothers and sisters. When we keep our focus on Jesus and live a life of commitment and love, we are sure to follow Jesus. Jesus' commandment, love one another as I have loved you, seems in full relief here because Jesus loved his own mother and disciples and many others with great respect and responsibility and commitment. That is what we are called to do, to love one another as Jesus loves us. Dear friends, this is a passage that has to make a great sense to all of us in our daily lives. Following Jesus does not mean that you radically leave everything. No, we have to completely focus our attention on Jesus, and our concentrated focus on Jesus should inspire us how we need to love our parents, brothers and sisters, our relatives, friends, and our neighbors, whoever comes to our life. That should be our attitude. When we are focused on Jesus, when we are concentrated in following the commandment of love Jesus has given us, love one another as I have loved you, certainly we will derive our strength, we will get our strength to love others, even our parents, brothers and sisters, from that love of Jesus. Because Jesus' love, our commitment to Jesus, our wholehearted dedication and devotion to Jesus will give us this real strength to live our life in a manner Jesus expects us to live. That is actually the real good news that Jesus wants to give us today. God bless you.